He already knew what was inside: a name, an address, a number with enough zeros to make a man feel temporarily invincible. But he let it sit there between the 2 cups of barley tea like an uninvited guest neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Across from him, Mr. Park folded his hands and said nothing. That was the thing about Park. He never begged, he never pressured. He simply placed things in front of you and let your own hunger do the rest. Same terms, Park said finally. Same terms, come? Tobe repeated, not as agreement, just as confirmation that he'd heard. He picked up the envelope. He told himself, walking out of that restaurant in Mapo and into the sharp October air of Seoul, that this was the last one. He had been telling himself that for 3 years. He was almost used to the sound of his own lying. Tobe chukwu adaize, Tobe to everyone, nobody to most, had come to Seoul at 26 for reasons he never fully explained even to himself. The official story was a job. The real story was that Lagos had started to feel like a room that was slowly running out of air, and Seoul was the first exit someone had offered him that didn't lead somewhere worse. He was good at the work. He was good at reading rooms, reading men, making things disappear. Documents, problems, people who needed to become strangers to the official record. He was not a violent man by nature. He was a precise man who lived in a violent industry and had, over 5 years, become very skilled at pretending those 2 things were not a contradiction. He lived in a small apartment in Mapagu, 3 floors above a pojangmacha that smelled of fish cake and soju every night from 8 until the city remembered it had to wake up again. He had no plants. He had no photographs on the walls. He had a go bag under the bed that he repacked every 3 months the way other men serviced their cars. Not because he planned to use it, but because the option needed to stay open. That was the architecture of his life, always a door, never a room he'd actually moved into. He first saw Ha-eunjin on a Tuesday, which mattered only because Tuesdays were when the street market ran along the side alley behind Mangwon Station, and he had stopped to buy persimmons from a cart operated by an old man who argued with every customer as a form of affection. She was at the stall next to it, negotiating for dried anchovies with the absolute seriousness of someone brokering a peace treaty. She was losing, and she knew she was losing, and she kept going anyway. He's cheating you, Tobe said, in Korean that carried the slight Lagos texture he'd never quite been able to sand off. She turned and looked at him with the particular expression Korean women reserve for men who offered unsolicited opinions, a look that started at the top of his head and ended somewhere around his assumptions. I know, she said. I come here every week. He knows I know. It's basically a ritual at this point. He laughed. He could not remember the last time he had laughed at something a stranger said. Her name was Eunjin. She ran a small restaurant in Mangwon, not a trendy one, not the kind that appeared in food blogs and had lines around the block, but the quiet, reliable kind that had been in the same spot for 22 years, first under her mother and now, for the past 18 months since her mother's death, under her. She served 3 things exceptionally well: doenjang jjigae, soybean sprout rice, and a mackerel dish she'd been making since she was 11 years old, standing on a step stool in her mother's kitchen. She was 31. She had a small scar on her left wrist from a burn she'd gotten at 13. She told him this 6 weeks after they met, on a night when he was helping her carry bags from the market, and the story came out simply, the way good stories do, without announcement, without drama, with the plainness of something that had already become part of a person's landscape. Does it still hurt? He asked. No, she said, but I always know it's there. He understood that more than she knew. The restaurant was called Gayul Bap, autumn rice. It smelled of fermented paste and sesame, and the specific kind of clean that only comes from someone who scrubs a place not out of obligation, but out of love. Eunjin arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 10 at night on most days. She did her own accounts. She fixed her own pipes when she could. She negotiated with her landlord with the same bright, unbending stubbornness she brought to the anchovy vendor. She was not effortlessly charming in the way that made things easy. She was the harder kind of magnetic, the kind that didn't work to pull you in, but simply existed, and you found yourself orbiting. He started coming in for lunch on Thursdays, then Wednesdays, then a Tuesday. which was not a lunch day because she was closed on Tuesdays, and he stood outside like an idiot for 3 minutes before he remembered this and walked away trying to look like he'd had somewhere else to be all along. "You came on a Tuesday," she said on Thursday, without looking up from the stove. "I was in the area." "You live 4 stations away." He sat down. "How do you know where I live?" "You pay by card." "I have eyes." She set a bowl of soup in front of him that she hadn't asked if he wanted. "You should just come on days we're open." "I'm usually busy." "Doing what?" He said the thing he always said. "Logistics." She looked at him for a moment. Not suspicious, not probing, just clear. "You say that word the way people say, 'I'm fine,'" she told him. "Like it's a door you're not opening." He didn't answer. He ate the soup. It was the best thing he'd eaten in 3 years. They fell into each other the way 2 careful people fall, slowly, and then with a speed that frightened both of them. He helped with the evening prep on slow nights when she let him, which was not often because she was territorial about her kitchen and particular about the way things were done. But slowly, she started assigning him tasks. "Peel these, chop these, don't touch the ganjang, I will know." And there was something in the smallness of those instructions, the domesticity of being trusted with a task that mattered to someone, that did something to him he couldn't name. One night in November, 2 months after the persimmon incident, he was washing the last of the bowls while she counted the register. The restaurant was empty. Rain tapped at the window. She turned off the overhead light and turned on the small lamp by the counter instead. And for a moment, the whole place glowed amber. The wooden tables, her profile, the steam still rising from the drying bowls. And he thought, this is a real thing. This exists. He had not thought that about anything in a very long time. "Eunjin," he said. Why did you let me stay?" She considered this without stopping what she was doing. "Because you looked like someone who kept forgetting that he was allowed to rest," she said. "And I have a weakness for that. My mother was the same." He set down the bowl he was holding very carefully, so she wouldn't hear the way his hands had gone slightly unsteady. The problem was the envelope. The problem was always the envelope. The job Park had given him was straightforward on the surface. The documentation kind, not the physical kind. A man named Kwon needed his paper trail altered before a certain audit reached a certain desk. Tobe had done variations of this 11 times before. He was the best at it in a specific triangle of Seoul's grey economy. He had never asked too many questions because questions were expensive, and ignorance was a kind of protection. This time, 3 weeks into seeing Eunjin's face in the amber light and thinking about rest, he started asking questions. What he found made him close his laptop and sit in the dark of his apartment for an hour without moving. Kwon was not a simple fraudster. Kwon was connected to a network that had destroyed several things Tobe would have preferred not to know about. The documentation he was about to alter would bury a case involving people who had very little power and had lost what little they had. It was not the first time his work had landed somewhere like this. It was the first time he had let himself look at where it landed. He called Park. "I'm out," he said. Silence. Then, "That's not how this works, Tobe. I'm telling you how it works for me. The envelope. Keep it." He heard Park breathing. He heard the calculation happening behind that breathing. The risk assessment, the recalibration. "You understand what you're saying," Park said, and it was not a question. "Yes." He hung up and sat in the dark a while longer. Then he got up, took the go bag out from under the bed, and instead of repacking it, he unzipped it and stared at it for a long time. Then he put it in the corner of the room. Not under the bed, the corner, where he could see it. He didn't go to Gal Bap on Thursday. He didn't go on the following Thursday either. She texted him on the second Friday, a short message, no punctuation, in the way she texted, "You disappeared." He stared at the 2 words for a long time. He wrote back, "I'm handling something." She wrote, "Okay." Then, 20 minutes later, "The mackerel is good today." He laughed, alone in his apartment, at 2 words about fish, and it came out of him ragged and a little alarming, like something that had been stored under pressure. He went back on Saturday morning. She was alone, doing prep, When he knocked on the glass, she looked up and her face did the thing it did. Not a big thing, just a subtle settling, like a person who had been holding a posture and released it slightly. She unlocked the door without saying anything. He came in. She handed him an apron. They worked in silence for 20 minutes before she said without looking up, "What are you handling?" "Something I should have stopped a long time ago." "Did you stop it?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Her knife kept moving. "Is it going to come back?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't." She put the knife down and turned to face him. She had flour on her forearm and her hair was pulled back with the small clip she always used for morning prep. She looked at him the way she sometimes did, like she was not reading his surface but something lower down. "Tobe," she said, "I'm not going to ask you to explain everything right now. I don't need that. But I need you to understand something." She paused, choosing her words with the same care she chose her fish. "My mother worked in this kitchen for 22 years. She built this slowly, every morning, every night. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't fast, and there were years when I watched her and thought, is this really enough? Is this really what a life looks like?" She picked up the knife again, but held it loosely. "And then she died, and I stood in here alone for the first time, and I understood. She had built the most real thing I had ever seen. She had built it with her hands, every day, and nothing could take it from her, because it was already given to me, given to the people who sat at these tables, given to herself." She looked at him. "I think about that when I look at you sometimes." "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "I think you're very good at surviving," she said. "I think you've been surviving so long you forgot to ask yourself what you're surviving for." The room was very still. Outside, the street was starting its morning. Delivery trucks, the Pojang Matcha man rolling up his cart from the night before, a child arguing with a grandmother about something small and important. "I never built anything," Toby said. It came out plain. Not as complaint, not as confession really, just as the recognition of a fact he had been standing next to for years without naming it. "You could," she said. He stayed. Not just that morning. He stayed in the weeks that followed, in the way that matters, the unsexy, uncinematic way, showing up on prep days, learning her system instead of imposing his own, sitting across from her when she did her accounts and asking questions, instead of pretending he had no stake in the outcome. He told her more, not everything, not all at once, but in pieces, the way you dismantle something carefully when you want to be sure you're not destroying it but understanding it. She listened without flinching. She asked hard questions. She did not offer him absolution or tell him it was fine or recast what he'd been into something softer. She simply said, once, sitting across from him after closing, "The person who did those things made choices. You're a person who makes choices. Those aren't the same person unless you keep making them." He felt the weight of that settle into him like something structural. Park sent someone to the restaurant once, a young man in a grey jacket who sat at the corner table and ordered tea and said nothing but made sure Toby saw him. Tobe saw him. He waited until the man left, then told Unjin calmly that they might need to talk about something. He told her about Park. He told her more of the shape of things. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "What are you going to do about it?" "I have some options," he said. "Tell me the one that keeps you here," she said. He worked through the options. It took 2 weeks and cost him a significant portion of what he'd saved and required 2 conversations he would prefer not to have had. But it worked. The door closed. Not with a bang, with the quiet, final click of a man removing himself from an architecture that had been built around his compliance. The go bag stayed in the corner of the room. Some nights he still looked at it, but it started to feel less like a plan and more like a scar, present, acknowledged, no longer in charge of the body it marked. On a Wednesday in February, cold enough that the restaurant windows were steaming from the inside, Unjin let him watch her make the mackerel dish for the first time. It was methodical and precise and tender in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment. She handled the fish the way she handled everything, with full attention, with respect for what it had been and what it was becoming. She didn't explain as she worked. He didn't ask. He just watched her hands, At the end, she plated 2 portions and set one in front of him. "Tell me what you taste," she said. He ate. He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother," he said finally. She looked at him for a beat, then nodded once, small, almost private, and picked up her chopsticks. He understood, sitting at that table with the steam and the cold outside and the amber lamp and the mackerel, and the woman who had refused to let him disappear without his own permission. He understood that love did not arrive as rescue. It arrived as witness. It stood next to you while you became accountable to yourself. And it did not do the work for you, and it did not wait forever. But on the days you actually showed up and did the work, it was there, solid, chosen, renewed. He had spent 5 years in Seoul perfecting the art of not needing anything. What he had not understood, what Eunjin and her hands and her mother's kitchen and the small ritual of Wednesday mackerel had slowly taught him, was that not needing anything was not freedom. It was just another kind of cage. A clean one, a quiet one you could mistake for independence if you'd never seen what the real thing looked like. He had never built anything. He thought about that on the walk home that night, through the cold Mangwon streets, past the Pojangmacha and the dark market stalls and the lights of the apartment blocks stacked up into the black February sky. He thought about what it would mean to start, not to transform overnight, not to become someone unrecognizable, not to pretend the past was anything other than what it was. Just to start, to place something in the ground and tend it, to show up every day for what you were trying to build and trust that the accumulation of those days was itself the point. The envelope had promised him a number with zeros. What it had actually offered him was one more increment of a life he was about to outlive his usefulness to. He chose differently. He chose, and then he chose again the next morning, and the one after that, which is the only way choosing ever actually works. Word count. 3,050 words, no headings. Third-person POV. Action open hook. Heavy dialogue. Emotional escalation throughout. Let me know if you'd like a YouTube short script, SEO package, or whisk scene prompts for this one, Temi.